is just my servant. But the Registry told another story.
Words can be the sharpest weapons when wielded by those who understand their power. In the records of American slavery, few betrayals cut deeper than those masked by seemingly innocent statements spoken in courthouse registries. Have you ever experienced that moment when someone you trusted completely changed your life with a single sentence? That cold realization that your future was never yours to control? Have you ever felt the ground crumble beneath your feet when you discovered the depth of someone's deception? That visceral pain of betrayal where trust becomes a poisoned well? We carry these wounds silently, thinking no one else could possibly understand. But some stories from history mirror our modern pain with haunting precision. The air in Charleston hung thick with salt and humidity on that summer morning in 1851. The cobblestone streets glistened from an early rain as Margaret Wilkes made her way toward the county courthouse, her silk dress rustling softly with each deliberate step. Behind her walked Samuel, maintaining a respectful distance as they navigated the bustling street. His weathered hands were folded neatly at his waist, eyes downcast in practiced deference, yet occasionally lifting to survey the faces they passed. To anyone observing this common sight in antebellum South Carolina, nothing would have seemed unusual about the wealthy white woman and the black man following in her shadow. Margaret had inherited her father's shipping business 5 years earlier, an unusual circumstance that raised eyebrows throughout Charleston society. A woman running a business of such scale was nearly unheard of, but Margaret proved herself shrewd and capable. The company flourished under her guidance, expanding routes and doubling profits within 3 years. And always at her side was Samuel, her father's most trusted servant who now served as her right hand in managing the complex affairs of Wilkes Shipping. Samuel Johnson had been with the Wilkes family for over 20 years. His intelligence and literacy, kept carefully hidden from most, made him invaluable first to Margaret's father and now to her. His knowledge of shipping routes, captain tendencies, and cargo management surpassed even the most experienced white clerks employed by the company. But what truly bound Margaret and Samuel was a secret that could destroy them both if discovered. For Samuel was not merely a servant, as Margaret claimed to her peers. The carefully hidden truth was that Margaret had granted Samuel his freedom papers 3 years ago, following her father's deathbed request. In the eyes of the law, Samuel was a free man. Yet they both understood the practical impossibility of a black man operating openly in Charleston business circles. Their solution was a dangerous charade, where Samuel remained publicly as her servant, while privately functioning as her business partner, with financial arrangements hidden in coded ledgers. Their arrangement had functioned smoothly until James Crawford entered their lives. The ambitious young lawyer had recently moved to Charleston from Boston with intentions to establish himself among the city elite. His northern manners concealed a ruthless ambition, and he quickly set his sights on Margaret as a potential wife. Her wealth and business connections would provide the perfect foundation for his political aspirations. What Crawford could not abide, however, was the obvious respect and closeness Margaret showed to Samuel, a relationship that transcended the proper boundaries between master and slave. On a warm evening at a society function, Crawford had cornered Margaret on the veranda. "I notice how you rely on your servant for business matters, a dangerous practice allowing a Negro such liberties," Margaret recalled him saying, his voice honeyed but eyes cold. Margaret had laughed lightly, assuring him that Samuel was simply well trained for his duties. But Crawford pressed further. "There are rumors, Margaret, rumors that could harm your standing. Perhaps it is time to sell him and bring in more appropriate management for your company." His hand had rested possessively on her arm as he spoke, his meaning unmistakable. Margaret had extricated herself politely, but the threat lingered like smoke. That night Margaret had shared Crawford's comments with Samuel in the privacy of her office. The danger was clear to both of them, for if it became known that Samuel was actually a free man living under false pretenses, the consequences would be severe. For Samuel it could mean re-enslavement or worse. For Margaret, financial ruin and social ostracism. Their carefully constructed world balanced on the edge of a knife. What neither knew was that Crawford had already begun investigating. His suspicions about their relationship drove him to search for leverage that would force Margaret's hand in marriage. He bribed clerks and officials, seeking any irregularity in the Wilkes business records or household management. His persistence eventually led him to a retired courthouse clerk who remembered an unusual transaction 3 years earlier. A manumission document, filed quietly but legally, granting freedom to a slave named Samuel Johnson, property of the late William Wilkes, released by his daughter Margaret. The discovery was exactly what Crawford needed. With this knowledge, he could expose Samuel as a free black man illegally passing as a slave, a criminal offense that would see him jailed and potentially sold back into slavery. He could simultaneously ruin Margaret's reputation by revealing her complicity in the deception. The scandal would leave her with no choice but to accept his protection through marriage. Crawford invited Margaret to dinner at his home, ensuring they would be alone except for his own household slaves. As the evening progressed, he skillfully steered the conversation toward her business affairs and, inevitably, to Samuel. "Your servant seems unusually devoted to your interests," Crawford remarked casually, watching her face for reaction. "He must be quite valuable to you." Margaret maintained her composure, years of navigating Charleston society having trained her well in the art of pleasant deflection. "Samuel has been with our family since I was a child. He is indeed loyal and capable." Her voice betrayed nothing as she sipped her wine. Crawford leaned forward, his mask of civility slipping slightly. "And what would you do if you lost him?" His tone made it clear this was no hypothetical question. Margaret felt her heart quicken but kept her expression neutral. "I suppose I would manage as any business owner must when facing changes in staff." "Why do you ask such a strange question?" Crawford smiled, reaching into his desk drawer to retrieve a folded document. "Because, my dear Margaret, I have discovered something quite interesting about your Samuel." He slid the paper across the table toward her, a copy of the manumission record, complete with her signature. Margaret felt ice spreading through her veins as she recognized the document, but refused to reach for it. Her mind raced through possibilities, calculating risks and outcomes, with the same precision she applied to business ledgers. "I don't understand your meaning, James. What is this paper supposed to signify?" Crawford's smile hardened. "Do not play innocent with me. This is proof that your servant Samuel is actually a free man. You have been harboring him in violation of South Carolina law, which requires free persons of color to register annually and maintain special papers, neither of which Samuel has done. The penalties for him are severe, for you as well as his accomplice." Margaret understood the gravity of her situation. Crawford had discovered their secret and was now wielding it as a weapon, but Margaret Wilkes had not built a shipping empire by surrendering easily to threats. She needed time and a strategy. "What is it you want, James?" she asked directly, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. Crawford reached across the table to take her hand. "Only what I have wanted since I first met you. Marriage. Your business acumen combined with my legal and political connections would make us a formidable force in Charleston. Together, we could build something extraordinary." He paused, his grip tightening slightly. "Or I could report what I know to the authorities tomorrow morning, and you would lose everything, including your precious Samuel." Margaret withdrew her hand, her mind already formulating a plan. "This is quite sudden, James. Surely you understand I need time to consider such a proposal." Crawford nodded, satisfied that his leverage was effective. "Of course, my dear. Take a week to consider your options, though I believe they are quite limited. In the meantime, I suggest you keep Samuel close. It would be unfortunate if he were to disappear before our arrangement is finalized." As Margaret left Crawford's home that evening, her composed exterior hid a storm of emotions. She had 1 week to save both herself and Samuel from Crawford's machinations. The moment she returned home, she summoned Samuel to her study and revealed Crawford's discovery and ultimatum. Samuel absorbed the news with the stoic dignity that had helped him survive decades of bondage before his legal freedom. He knew better than most how precarious freedom could be for a black man in the South. "We must act quickly," he said, his mind already working on solutions. "Perhaps it is time for me to leave Charleston. I could make my way north where my papers would be recognized." Margaret shook her head firmly. "That would be an admission of guilt that would still leave me at Crawford's mercy. No, we need a solution that neutralizes his threat entirely." Her eyes took on the determined gleam that Samuel recognized from their most challenging business negotiations. "I believe I know what we must do." The next morning, Margaret and Samuel arrived at the county courthouse just as it opened. Samuel followed at the proper distance as they entered the imposing building, maintaining the charade that had protected them for years. They were here to examine the original manumission document and registry that Crawford had somehow accessed. The elderly clerk recognized Margaret immediately. "Good morning, Miss Wilkes. What business brings you to the courthouse today?" Margaret smiled pleasantly. "I need to review some property records from my father's estate. There seems to be a discrepancy that requires clarification." The clerk nodded sympathetically. "Of course, these matters can become quite confused after a death. Follow me to the records room." As they entered the dimly lit room lined with leather-bound volumes, Margaret spoke casually. "I believe the documents I need would be from 3 years ago, shortly after my father's passing." The clerk pulled several large books from the shelves, laying them on the oak table. "Property transfers would be in this volume." He patted a dusty tome. "Wills and estates in this one." His hand hesitated over the third book. "And manumissions in this register, though I doubt you'd have cause to examine those." Margaret noted the clerk's slight emphasis on the last words and the quick glance he gave Samuel. It confirmed her suspicion that Crawford had indeed bribed someone here for information. Thank you. I'll examine these carefully. Would you be so kind as to fetch me a glass of water? The journey here was rather warm. Once alone with Samuel, they quickly located the critical document in the manumission register. There it was, dated June 18, 1848, the legal instrument that had granted Samuel his freedom, signed by Margaret and witnessed by 2 court officials, one of whom was now deceased. Samuel whispered urgently, "There is no way to remove this without notice. The pages are numbered and any alteration would be obvious." Margaret nodded, having already realized this, but her gaze had caught something else entirely. The space on the facing page contained another entry, dated 2 weeks later. It documented the manumission of a house slave named Eleanor by a plantation owner who had fathered her children. But there was a notation in the margin that Margaret found intriguing, written in faded ink, reversed by order of court, July 30th, 1848, due to procedural defect in filing. Subject returned to previous status. Before they could discuss this discovery, the clerk returned with water. Margaret thanked him graciously and made a show of examining the property records while surreptitiously studying the manumission register further. After an appropriate interval, she closed the books and thanked the clerk for his assistance. Outside the courthouse, Margaret shared her discovery with Samuel as they walked. "There may be a way to invalidate your manumission document retroactively. If we could prove some procedural defect in the filing, the court might reverse it officially just as they did with that poor woman Eleanor." Samuel's expression darkened. "You would have me return to slavery? Even on paper?" Margaret stopped, turning to face him despite the impropriety of such direct engagement on a public street. "Never in reality, but if the official record shows the manumission was invalidated, Crawford's evidence becomes worthless. He would have no leverage against either of us. It would be a paper fiction only while our private arrangement continues unchanged." Samuel considered this, understanding the ruthless logic behind it. A bitter solution, but perhaps the only one available to them. "And what happens when Crawford checks the records again?" Margaret smiled grimly. "By then, I believe he will find the matter closed in more ways than one. But first, we need a legal expert who can be trusted. Not everyone in Charleston's legal community shares Crawford's ambitions or methods. I want to pause this story for a moment to ask you directly. When was the last time you trusted someone and felt that stab in your chest, that silent warning that something wasn't right? I know you may never have shared this with anyone. It's that pain we keep, thinking no one will understand. But here, in this space we're creating together, your experience matters. If you've felt this silent betrayal, leave in the comments just the words, "I recognize this feeling," and see how many people share this invisible wound. Your comment could be the first step for someone to realize they're not alone on this journey. Let's continue the story now, but carrying this reflection with us. Margaret arranged a discreet meeting with Judge William Harrington, an elderly jurist who had been her father's friend. Though retired from active bench duty, Harrington still commanded respect in legal circles and, more importantly, had always shown a quiet compassion unusual in Charleston society. Margaret visited him alone at his home, ostensibly to seek advice on a business matter. After ensuring they would not be overheard, Margaret revealed the essence of her predicament without implicating herself directly. She presented it as a hypothetical legal question. If a manumission document were filed incorrectly, could it be retroactively invalidated? And what would be the status of the freed person in such a case? Judge Harrington studied Margaret carefully over his spectacles. "This hypothetical situation," he said slowly, "seems remarkably specific, Miss Wilkes." His eyes conveyed understanding beyond his words. "In such a case, yes, a procedural defect could render the document void. The most common defects involve improper witnesses, lack of required payments to the court, or failure to register the freed person properly afterward." Margaret seized on this last point. "And if the freed person failed to register annually as required by law?" Harrington nodded gravely. "That would indeed constitute grounds for nullification of the manumission. The person would legally revert to their previous status." His gaze sharpened. "However, I must caution that manipulating such matters is a serious offense." Margaret leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if the manipulation has already occurred on the other side? What if someone intends to use such a document for blackmail, threatening both the former owner and the freed person with exposure and ruin?" Harrington's expression shifted subtly. "Blackmail is a far more serious offense than administrative oversights, Miss Wilkes. But to pursue such a remedy, one would need a sympathetic ear in the court registry, and compelling evidence of the registration failure." Margaret understood his meaning perfectly. "Thank you for your guidance, Judge Harrington. Your hypothetical advice has been most illuminating." The following day, Margaret visited another contact, a clerk named Thomas Reynolds, who had once been saved from financial ruin by her father's timely loan. Reynolds worked in the annual Registry office that documented free persons of color, a critical but often overlooked department of Charleston's bureaucracy. When Margaret explained what she needed, taking care to emphasize the threat Crawford posed to both her and Samuel, Reynolds was reluctant but ultimately cooperative. Reynolds confirmed what Margaret suspected. There was no record of Samuel Johnson ever registering as a free man of color following his manumission. This administrative failure provided the legal basis for invalidating his freedom document. With Reynolds' assistance, Margaret drafted a petition to have the manumission retroactively nullified due to non-compliance with registration requirements. Judge Harrington, though officially retired, still had connections throughout the court system. Through his discreet intervention, the petition was assigned to a sympathetic judge who processed it without public notice, as was common in matters involving property disputes. Within 3 days, a court order was issued invalidating Samuel's manumission on technical grounds. The official record now showed that Samuel Johnson had never legally been freed, effectively neutralizing Crawford's leverage. But Margaret was not satisfied with merely defensive measures. Crawford's willingness to use blackmail revealed a character that would remain a threat as long as he had ambitions in Charleston. Her business experience had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a decisive counterattack. Through Samuel's network of contacts among Charleston's enslaved community, Margaret learned that Crawford had secrets of his own. Despite his public persona as a respectable bachelor, he had been maintaining an illicit relationship with a young mixed-race woman named Lucia, who lived in a small house he kept on the outskirts of town. Such arrangements were not uncommon among Charleston's elite men, but Crawford's hypocrisy lay in his public advocacy for stricter racial separation laws, even as he violated those principles in private. More damning still, Samuel's contacts discovered that Crawford had promised Lucia her freedom in exchange for her companionship, a promise he had documented in a private letter, but had no intention of honoring. The letter, which Lucia had kept hidden, provided Margaret with the leverage she needed. Through careful intermediaries, Margaret arranged to purchase Lucia from her nominal owner, another layer of deception Crawford had established to maintain appearances. Once the transaction was complete, Margaret granted Lucia genuine freedom papers and helped arrange her passage to Philadelphia, where she had family. Before departing, Lucia gratefully provided Crawford's incriminating letter to Margaret. Armed with this evidence of Crawford's duplicity and hypocrisy, Margaret was ready for his return. When Crawford arrived at her home to receive her answer to his marriage proposal, Margaret greeted him with calm confidence. "Have you reached a decision, Margaret?" Crawford asked, his tone conveying certainty in his victory. Margaret smiled pleasantly. "Indeed I have, James. Please sit down." She gestured to a chair across from her desk, a subtle positioning that placed him in the role of supplicant rather than equal. Once seated, she continued, "I must decline your proposal, as generous as it was." Crawford's expression hardened. "I don't think you understand your situation, Margaret. I have evidence that could ruin you." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "You referred to the manumission document for Samuel, granting him freedom 3 years ago." She opened a folder on her desk. "Unfortunately for your plans, that document has been legally invalidated." She slid a copy of the court order across the desk. "As you can see, the manumission was nullified last week due to procedural defects. Samuel remains legally my slave, just as I have always claimed publicly. Your leverage has evaporated." Crawford scanned the document, his confidence visibly crumbling. "This is impossible. You manufactured this after I revealed what I knew." Margaret's expression remained pleasant. "The courts would disagree. But more importantly, James, I have discovered some interesting aspects of your own affairs." She removed Crawford's letter to Lucia from the folder and placed it on the desk between them. "Your promise of freedom to your mistress makes for particularly compelling reading, especially when contrasted with your public positions on race relations." The color drained from Crawford's face as he recognized his own handwriting. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, reaching for the letter. Margaret placed her hand firmly on the document. "Lucia provided it willingly before departing for Philadelphia yesterday, with proper freedom papers that, unlike your promises, are legally binding." Crawford stood abruptly. "You have overstepped, Margaret. This is blackmail." Margaret remained seated, her voice steady. "No, James. This is protection against a threat. The difference is significant, both legally and morally." Her eyes hardened. "You came to my home threatening to destroy lives for your own advancement. I have simply ensured that option is no longer available to you." She rose now, matching his stance. "Here is what will happen next. You will withdraw from any business or social circles that include me or my associates. You will abandon any investigations or rumors concerning my household management. In return, this letter remains private. Should you choose another path, copies will find their way to every influential home in Charleston, as well as to your colleagues in the newspapers. Crawford's expression twisted with rage, but his legal mind recognized the completeness of his defeat. You would have made a formidable adversary in court, Margaret. Margaret simply nodded. I believe our business is concluded. Samuel will show you out. The ultimate humiliation for Crawford was being escorted from the house by the very man he had attempted to use as leverage against Margaret. Samuel's face revealed nothing as he opened the front door, but his eyes met Crawford's with quiet dignity that conveyed everything. In the weeks that followed, Crawford gradually withdrew from Charleston society, eventually relocating to New Orleans, where his past would not follow him. Margaret and Samuel continued their careful arrangement, their secret now more securely protected than before. The court records showed Samuel as her legal property, while in private, their partnership continued to flourish. The irony was not lost on either of them. To protect Samuel's practical freedom, they had been forced to legally revoke it. The documents that Crawford had discovered as weapons against them had been rendered harmless, but at the cost of returning Samuel to slavery on paper. It was a bitter compromise necessitated by the cruel realities of their time. 3 years later, as tensions between North and South escalated toward inevitable conflict, Margaret made arrangements to relocate her business headquarters to Philadelphia, ostensibly to better manage the northern shipping routes. Samuel accompanied her on this journey north, and once safely across the Mason-Dixon line, his freedom became both practical and legal. Margaret established him as a free business agent in her northern office, an arrangement that raised eyebrows but could not be challenged under Pennsylvania law. The registry that had once recorded Samuel's brief legal freedom in Charleston now told a different story. The official record showed him as Margaret's property until their departure from South Carolina. But the true history of their relationship, the trust and mutual respect that had sustained them through Crawford's threats and beyond, would never appear in any official document. It existed in the lived reality of their shared enterprise and in the quiet dignity with which they navigated a system designed to separate them. The story of Margaret and Samuel reminds us that official records often conceal as much as they reveal. Behind the dry documents of property transfers and court orders lie human stories of resistance, compromise, and the complex moral choices forced upon people by unjust systems. The registry told one story to the world, while the truth remained known only to those who lived it. In our own lives, we encounter situations where official versions diverge from lived realities. The lesson of Margaret and Samuel's story is not that deception is virtuous, but that survival sometimes requires painful compromises, and that true freedom exists not merely in legal documents, but in the dignity with which we treat one another, even in the most constrained circumstances. These stories of betrayal and resistance are not just accounts of the past, but echoes that still resonate in our experiences. If you, like me, believe that knowing these truths is fundamental to healing historical wounds, this channel is your space. By subscribing, you'll receive weekly, meticulously researched narratives about forgotten figures who faced impossible choices during the slavery period. Each subscription helps us amplify this voice that has been silenced for too long. Join us in this commitment to memory and truth.